Hi there, this is John Wilkinson from History Made Easier, and this is the second of two presentations which together explore 10 key factors to the League of Nations and to its work. Moving on to the League's work in the 1920s, I think the key thing to consider is just how real or significant were its successes in maintaining peace. The Åland Islands dispute, the Albanian dispute with Yugoslavia, and the Mosul dispute were all successfully resolved by the League. And the Upper Silesia referendum and the dispute between Greece and Bulgaria could be put in the success column, if with caveats, and you should refer to those caveats. But were they major issues? Mosul involved Britain and Upper Silesia involved Germany. But neither Britain or Germany had acted aggressively and challenged the League. On a much more positive side, the work of the various commissions, though not a total success, were nevertheless considerable successes, improving lives for millions of people in different ways. You have to prepare for a possible question on the commissions, and you should include their work in any 1920s question, or in any question on the overall success of the League. Don't underestimate the important work of the commissions. But Vilna, Memel, the occupation of the Ruhr, and the Corfu incident were all worrying failures for the League. The League does not get off to a good start with the Vilna dispute, and the Conference of Ambassadors gets involved in Vilna, Memel, and Corfu, whilst the occupation of the Ruhr by the French and Belgians, of course, involves Germany, the country with the biggest grievance against the peace treaties the League is responsible for upholding. Whilst Corfu, of course, involves Italy, the country that looked at the treaties as the mutilated victory. And Mussolini would take Italy into Abyssinia, the act that finally destroyed what credibility the League still had. And Mussolini would align with Hitler in the Pact of Steel, and Germany and Japan in the Anti-Comintern Pact. So we should see the League's failures in the 1920s as significant. And there were other initiatives that, though some were positive in ways, they were at the same time throwing a question mark against the League's authority. I'm talking about the Geneva Protocol of 1924, which was a disaster for the League. The Locarno Treaties of 1925, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1925, and the Dawes and Young Plans of 1924 and 1929 respectively. These were positive initiatives, but at the same time they did undermine the authority of the League, and they certainly showed the need for American involvement in international affairs. Now, a principal aim of the League was to encourage economic trade between countries, and in that way help to ensure peace. But in an economic depression, the word more is replaced by less. And the depression that began with the crash of the American stock market in 1929, the Wall Street crash, led to the biggest depression the world had known at that time, the Great Depression. So less meant much less as banks went bankrupt and farms and businesses too. Less trade, less employment, less buying, and much less government spending on welfare provision, even though its need had never been greater. It was a terrible time. People not only lost jobs, but often their homes too. And the worst thing was they lost hope. And as liberal democracies struggled to find solutions, in their desperation people turned to extreme, undemocratic and nationalist parties who seemed to offer solutions. This is what happened in Germany and the rise of Adolf Hitler, and in Japan with the increased influence of the military. Whilst in Italy, though Mussolini had been directing policy before the Depression struck, there was an even further lurch to the right. So that in all three countries, an extreme form of militarism and nationalism dominated their policies. In total, something like 24 countries lurched towards one form or another of extremism. It destroyed any goodwill that had existed amongst nations and upon which the League depended. The effects of the Great Depression only added to existing tensions, whilst all the time creating new tensions. This meant that the League of Nations was now dealing with very different governments, more nationalistic with expansionist foreign policies, seeking new markets and sources of raw materials. They were more aggressive, and in the case of Germany, Japan, Italy, they had been unhappy with the Paris peace treaties too. Germany wanted to take back what it felt rightly belonged to it, and even expand, uniting all German people within its borders. Italy wanted an empire, and in Asia, Japan wanted an empire too. At the same time, other countries were prioritizing their own problems. There was pressure on governments to cut expenditure, and this delayed rearmament, even when the aggressive powers made their moves. And they were less inclined to cooperate with the League in imposing sanctions on aggressive powers. Sanctions would mean more jobs being lost in a depression that had accounted for millions of jobs already. The League was facing an impossible situation. No less than 4 permanent members of the League's Council would leave the League. Japan over Manchuria, Germany over disarmament, or at least that was the excuse, and Italy over Abyssinia. Russia, having only joined in 1934, was expelled when it invaded Finland at the end of November 1939, though it had already invaded Poland as part of the Nazi-Soviet pact. International cooperation broke down as nations simply ignored the League, which lost all authority. And we should also note that while Germany and Japan agreed an anti-Comintern pact in 1936, Italy joining it in 1937, Hitler and Stalin also agreed the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. I know I've already mentioned these things, but what it meant was that in one form or another, the 4 permanent council members to have left the League had formed pacts that were aggressive in nature. The League, or at least its members, failed in the 1930s, and the ways in which it failed, the reasons for its failure, and the significance of each failure could all be the focus of an exam question you face. Again, there will not be the detail in this presentation, but I hope I will be able to help you focus, help your analyses, and so help your responses in that exam hall. With regard to Manchuria, I think you can say that non-members were as big a problem as members. the Euro-centred League couldn't operate so far from Europe, not without American, or even more so, Russian membership. Russia was, as it is, an Asian power as much as it was, and still is, a European one. Neither could the League impose sanctions, again not without American membership, though also because of British and French concerns. Their empires were vulnerable to Japanese aggression. So, membership as well as non-membership was a key factor, and as a consequence, the League looked weak. Ultimately, it didn't stand up to a permanent member of its council. And that the League's authority was seriously weakened wasn't lost on either Mussolini or later Hitler. Then there was the Disarmament Conference of 1932 into 1933, and the League's members, notably France, but Germany too, were the main problem. France was adamant that for disarmament to take place, the League should have an army and an air force of its own, something they had always wanted for the League. But that wasn't going to happen. Britain, by this point very uneasy with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, was sympathetic to German concerns, though it also preferred to have a negotiated control over German rearmament, rather than have no agreement, leaving Germany to rearm with no checks placed on it. And this division between Britain and France enabled the Germans to play them off against each other. Twice Germany left the conference, and the second time, with Hitler now Chancellor, left the League altogether, which of course was exactly what Hitler wanted, leaving Germany free to openly rearm and triggering something of an arms race. Just what Britain had feared. And finally, there was the Abyssinian crisis. The failure to impose effective sanctions and the notorious Hall-Laval Pact. It left collective security dead in the water, the League having lost all credibility as a peacekeeping force, whilst fascism in both Italy and Germany and extreme nationalism in Japan were literally on the march. But the impact of the Great Depression was a critically important factor too. So, how to assess the League? Really, both the problems faced by the League and the different approaches have been entwined in everything I've already covered. And you can see them set out on this slide. But let's spell out the different approaches to assessing the League. First, did the League of Nations fail, or was it failed by others? This gives you on one side of the debate the chance to consider the problems related to the organisation of the League and the problems related to its members, a weakened Britain and a weakened France, and aggression from Japan, Italy and Germany. Whilst on the other side of the debate, you could consider the impact of America not joining. So, did America fail the League of Nations? Clearly, here you pitch the American non-membership factor against other factors. The League handicapped by the Treaty of Versailles, for example, or the impact of the Great Depression. Or did the League of Nations only fail when faced with unmanageable circumstances, the Great Depression and the rise of fascism and extreme nationalism. This gives you a chance to contrast the 1920s and 1930s, making use of examples of issues that would suggest this was the case, yet noting that there were still failures in the 1920s when circumstances were more favourable, whilst the League's commissions continued to do great work in the 30s. And in considering these different approaches, I think we've also covered reasons for the League's failure, should you get a question on those lines. Though don't forget that you can challenge the assumption of a question. That is, that the League did in fact fail, the point of my first approach. Or let's think even more radically. Can what the League did, and by implication what it didn't do, particularly in the 1930s, actually be justified? This is your chance to assess the League's response to crises realistically. Did the League do all it could, given the bad hand it had been dealt? Or could it have chosen different options? But there is also another factor you will need to consider, and it's for another topic. And that is, how far would you put World War II down to the League's failings? You need to consider the League's failings, but alongside the Treaty of Versailles and British appeasement, as well as considering the Great Depression as a factor, and Hitler as a factor. But ultimately, you need to consider to what extent was the League a success, or how far did the League fail. Success can be placed in the difficult, even impossible context in which the League was working. Failure can be measured against its aims and against what its failures ultimately led to. World War II, of course, but I'm also thinking of the Holocaust. So, there you have my key factors to consider as you revise the League of Nations. I hope it's given you useful things to think about. But don't forget to check out my website, History Made Easier. It's there to help you too. But I'll leave you now, but not before I thank you for listening. Good luck in those exams. Cheers.